And today I'd like to talk about the Second World War, which lasted from 1939 to 1945. This was certainly a war of aggression, of domination, but it was also quite different from previous wars. And it had a lot to do with oil and race. First, I'd like to talk about Germany's role in this war, before moving to the role of intelligence, which was a vital part of both the Allies and the Axis, the role of the Axis in trying to achieve their ends, and then turning to some key errors, tactical mistakes that Germany made, and then finishing up with the role that oil and race played in this war. Germany exhibited a pattern of increasing aggression throughout the 1930s. The Nazis were elected to power in 1932 in the midst of the Great Depression, and President Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor in January of 1933, a period of enormous chaos and confusion in Germany, and indeed in the industrial world as a whole. Hitler rode on a wave of enormous hatred against Jews, anti-Semitism, and promised to bring the country together by encouraging industry and workers and youth and the intellectuals to work together. So on the one hand, while marginalizing one sector of the population, primarily Jews, but also communists and socialists, he also sought to bring together other sectors whom the Nazis declared were the true Germany. Hitler was able to build on several successes well before the Second World War actually took place. One of these is a little discussed war in comparison. That's the Spanish Civil War, which lasted from 1936 to 1939. And that was a kind of testing ground for Hitler and for his colleague in Italy, Mussolini, to try out their weapons, their tactics, and support a military figure, General Franco, in sidelining and ending the Republic in Spain. And that effort was successful. Franco may well not have been able to win that war without the extensive aid of Germany and Italy. Germany then proceeded to have a campaign that was continually virtually the same. Declare that you needed to bring together people of a Germanic background and then march in. This was true in Austria, when the Nazis marched in to Austria in March of 1938. This was true in Czechoslovakia, which was a democracy and did not want to have any kind of Nazi aggression. Yes, there were sympathizers for Nazi Germany in Czechoslovakia, but the majority of the population was not in favor of being taken over. But Hitler declared, we must protect the German speakers in Czechoslovakia and march in and take over. The West effectively, in each of these situations, did nothing. At virtually no turn, where Hitler and the Nazis sidelined or attacked, counterattacked to stop this pattern of aggression. Quite the contrary, it seemed that Western democracies were paralyzed. Many feared communism more than they feared the Nazis. The Nazis, after all, supported capitalism. So they decided more or less to keep silent. The only serious foe for Nazi Germany was the Soviet Union. As the major communist power, it had little in common with Nazi Germany on political grounds. However, in one startling agreement, Hitler established a pact with Stalin that they would not attack each other and could divide up countries as they saw fit. This enabled Germany to turn its eyes on its neighbor, France, whom Germany had long resented since the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles. And in an astonishing 6 weeks, Germany managed to invade and take over the whole of France. This had never been attempted before, and for many French, it was a shock. This was a policy that Germany had had in place since its invasion of Poland in September of 1939, which is Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, in which you move in quickly and with overpowering panzer divisions, with airplanes, with artillery, with troops, and pummel the foe into submission. This worked extremely well for Germany up until 1941, and it certainly worked well in France. Germany was able to effectively divide France, which the Nazis would occupy the northern part, and the southern part, called the Vichy regime, they allowed the French to more or less look over. This is called the policy of collaboration. So at the end of 1940, the only power really that was able to resist Germany and its constant aggressive demands for more power and more land was Great Britain. Great Britain had the advantage of geography. It was separated by the English Channel, and so it had some means of a buffer to the advance of troops, of Germany's land troops. But I think it's fair to say that by the end of 1940, it appeared that no power could stop Nazi aggression. Of this war I'd like to discuss is the role of intelligence. Intelligence is an often, I think, underappreciated aspect of this war. It's not just about who has the most effective weapons and guns and so on, but also who has the most effective intelligence. Intelligence is crucial. You want to relay your messages to your own troops and your allies without interception, and thereby, hopefully, to have the element of surprise in any attack. You add that with a system of spies who will be able to continue to funnel in much needed information and always to update your systems of what the enemy might be planning in the future. Intelligence is nothing new. Certainly intelligence played a very important role in the First World War, but it was quite different in that war. You had a code book, and as long as you knew the code, then you could read the book. You could read the secret code transmissions that were sent, but that code book was essential in reading those messages. After the First World War, a number of engineers And cryptologists began working with a different system. And this is rotor cipher machines based on a series of rotor machines. And these would make breaking the code far more difficult. In the First World War, if you got a hold of the code book, then you knew the code. With the cipher machines, you can change the code at any given time, perhaps every minute. You just have to move and rotate the ciphers, these rotor machines. And this developed in the United States in the 1920s, and at the same time, it developed in Europe. Germany in particular adopted this system and created what became known as the Enigma machine. Enigma is a word for mystery, that you can't crack, an enigma. And Germany's Enigma machine seemed to have almost infinite complexity, with multiple rotors connected to electric wires that could transmit and change a signal, and therefore the code, at any given moment. So billions upon billions of permutations were accessible or available with this machine. So Germany thought it had found the perfect coding machine that no one could crack. On this, Germany ultimately proved to be wrong. Two teams, one operating in France, the other in England, sought to crack this code, crack this machine. Some Polish resistance fighters managed to get a copy of the Enigma machine, and then the English sought to make a copy of that copy and then tinker with it and develop to try to understand how was this machine crafted, how was it created, and then to be able to crack the code to the machine. Through enormous efforts of cryptologists, of mathematicians, of Egyptologists, anyone who works with a kind of code, the English managed to crack the Enigma code unbeknownst to the Germans. And that was key, because then anytime Germany set up or prepared an attack, the English and their allies, the French, the Americans, and so on, could try to prepare and then have a more effective counterattack. This advance in intelligence meant that by 1940, Germany now had a formidable foe, a foe at the very least armed with the knowledge of the Enigma code. A third aspect I'd like to talk about are some of the errors that Hitler and his generals made in this war. Errors that proved to be, in the end, fatal for Germany's effort to spread out and control all of Europe. The first of these was the Battle of Britain. This lasted for about a year and a half. It was a continued effort to pummel Britain into submission through planes, through bombing, by the German Luftwaffe, or Air Force. And it was certainly destructive for Britain. Over 15,000 people lost their lives. Most of the major cities of Britain suffered some damage, especially in East London, and some of the remnants of this bombing exist to this day. Britain counterattacked, and it had the advantage of American planes through the Lend-Lease Act, as the American military industry, began to increasingly build planes, even though the U.S. had not yet been formally brought into the war. And so an almost infinite number of planes that Britain had access to, that certainly helped, but also being able to crack the Enigma code and knowing when these planes might be arriving from Germany. And with the relatively recent development of radar, the British Air Force, the RAF, the Royal Air Force, could then rise up and counterattack as the planes began arriving. So no question, the German Luftwaffe created enormous damage. But this was a tactical error because Hitler thought he could destabilize, demoralize Britain, who he saw as weak. The Prime Minister, who became the Prime Minister in 1940, Winston Churchill, who was one of the only figures early on to recognize the danger that Hitler presented. Churchill sought to galvanize the nation, certainly to galvanize the RAF, and not permit any kind of submission. And through a combination of these efforts and an effective RAF, a strongly mobilized a nation that refused to submit, planes from the US, and the intelligence that helped for the Brits to counteract these attacks. All of this meant that one of the first major battles of this war, the Battle of Britain, Germany lost. It could not successfully invade Britain. So what do you do if your first idea of attacking to the west fails? You go for the east. And this was an astonishing effort on the part of the Nazis, because Germany and the Soviet Union had created a non-aggression pact. They would not attack each other, they would divide up the spoils. And Germany attacked. The argument was for Lebensraum, or literally living space, that if you look at the map of the Soviet Union, it is enormous, and it is filled with very important resources, including grain and oil. And Hitler reasoned, we can take the Soviet Union within a few months using our blitzkrieg attacks. The Soviets will not expect it. And before Christmas, or before winter sets in, Soviet Union will be subdued before any other allies could counterattack, and Germany will be that much stronger. It didn't quite work out that way. Germany was certainly initially successful in its blitzkrieg, created enormous havoc and damage through Russia. Here, the Russian peasants suffered terrible, debilitating tragedies. Nazi Germany the Nazi soldiers moved into Moscow and were able to seize much of Moscow. But what the Russians did was effectively what they did when Napoleon attacked over a century before, and that is, you pull back. There is infinite room, almost, to pull back in Soviet Russia, and you wait for winter to close in. And here, the tables were turned. The German soldiers were not nearly as well trained for winter combat as the Soviet soldiers were. The Soviet could engage in guerrilla warfare and attack supply lines from the rear guard of the Germans, much as had happened to Napoleon. And Germany was stuck, what is known as the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalin, who was initially stunned by this invasion, is also in part to blame for the initial successes of Germany. Not only that he had established a pact with Hitler, but he had killed off most of his best generals because they posed a threat to his power. So initially, in the first few months, Germany did exceedingly well, but Stalin managed to galvanize his populace, much as Churchill helped to galvanize his, and put up an effective front, not just German soldiers, but also German peasants, and simply refused to submit. This resulted in a debilitating loss for Germany. It was really a turning point in the war because many German soldiers, through the enormous atrocities that they had conducted during the course of this battle, many began to doubt the core beliefs of the Nazi Party and indeed for Germany. With all of the losses that Germany suffered, Germans began to question the role of the war for Germany and the increasing losses that it began to suffer. And a third major tactical error on the part of Nazi Germany was the declaration of war on the United States. Yes, without a doubt, the Japanese military's attack on Pearl Harbor fully brought the United States into the war. But at the same time, Hitler declared war on the U.S. because Japan and Nazi Germany were allies. This provided perfect fodder not just to go against Japan, as the U.S. certainly did, but also to turn against Germany. And the entry of the United States into this war after the Pearl Harbor attack of December 7th, 1941, really showed a change, a tipping in the balance. Once the U.S. fully garnered its forces and was able to force an invasion in France, known as D-Day, with the Soviet Union on the east and the American, British, Canadian, and Belgian, French allies to the west, Germany's days by 1944 were effectively numbered. And finally, this war was about oil and race. Oil played a key part in this war. Indeed, it would have been impossible without the many sources for oil that all of the planes and the jeeps and the tanks and so on demanded. So a critical reason, ultimately, why the Nazis lost is in part because they ran out of oil. They had oil fields in Romania, known as Plötzi, and part of the whole effort to invade the Soviet Union was to get to those oil fields that existed past the Ural Mountains. But ultimately, Germany did not have enough oil to continue this war. The United States and its allies most certainly did. And Germany had been developing rockets, which needed rocket fuel, but ultimately could not use them because they didn't have the fuel necessary to fuel those rockets. The Japanese military attacked installations throughout the Pacific, including Pearl Harbor, in part because the United States and Britain had sought to restrict Japan's access to oil and other resources. Japan, or Imperial Japan, was an expanding power at the time in the Pacific and demanded oil and other resources to continue that expansion. So Japan saw these attacks as fully justified because one could not expand without access to oil. This war was also about race. The destruction of people based on their race was the ultimate act of racism. And we see many examples of this throughout this war. Hitler came to power with people fully knowing his position on the Jews. He claimed the Jews were responsible for virtually all ills in Germany and needed to be destroyed, not simply removed, but to be destroyed. But not just Jews, also Slavs, people of color, the Roma or Gypsies, all of whom were attacked by Nazi Germany, placed in concentration camps, or just simply murdered outright. And they murdered them because they saw them as distinctly inferior. And all of this occurred with relatively little resistance by the German people. This is not to say that Hitler was universally loved and admired everywhere in Germany. There were pockets of resistance throughout the war. But on the whole, Germany supported these policies despite some efforts to assassinate Hitler, which were unsuccessful. The Japanese, too, saw virtually all peoples in Asia as inferior. The Chinese, the Vietnamese, Indonesians, they saw as fodder for their empire and could be subdued, especially if they surrendered, because they stood in the way. And so, like Nazi Germany, setting up concentration camps in which millions of people suffered or died. The issue of so-called comfort women, or the use of primarily Korean women as effectively sexual slaves, formed part of this ideology of outright racism in support of the Japanese military's regime. When the Americans interned over 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were U.S. citizens, this was an act of clear racism. There was no clear evidence of Japanese subversion, as it was called, or sabotage by Japanese Americans on U.S. soil. Nonetheless, seeing it as necessary to imprison an entire group based entirely on racial grounds. In Europe and in Japan, the destruction of a people based on their race was chilling because it was so scientifically done. When Germany began creating these concentration camps and then death camps for ultimately the extermination of entire groups, we know that an estimated 8 million people died in these camps, 6 million of whom were Jews. Half of those perhaps were Polish Jews. The rest were rounded up throughout much of Europe, wherever the Nazis held control, in France, in Greece, Italy, Bulgaria, Romania, where in many cases the governments of these countries almost gleefully handed over their Jews, people of color, Roma, because of widespread anti-Semitism or racism in these countries. The final results of this war is that an estimated 92 million people were mobilized, men and women, and somewhere between 40 to 60 million people, the exact numbers are very difficult to determine, but between 40 to 60 million people died as a result of either destruction or disease. It was the most destructive war in human history.